So what do we value in life? I think most people would put happiness at the top of that list or very close to it. And most of us spend a lot of our time trying to achieve happiness. So this title up here may seem a bit confusing. In fact, it may seem a bit counterintuitive. I mean, how can happiness actually cause harm, much less destroy the planet? But that depends. And it depends on what makes us happy or what we think makes us happy. And there's a distinction here, because when you ask people what makes you happy, they typically respond with things that are in their life today: their friends, their family, their jobs, their hobbies. When you ask people what would make you happy, you bring the future tense into the question. And that opens up a whole new level of possibility, and you start getting different answers. And oftentimes, things like power or money or fame come into play. Or, of course, stuff. People somehow connect material possessions with their happiness. Now, many research studies have shown this not to be true, that there is no real connection between our material wealth and our level of happiness. But yet there is this intrinsic desire inside most people to keep thinking, if I only had that next thing, if I only had the nice car, if I only had the fancy watch, or I hear that for women, if I only had those new Italian shoes, I could be happier. And so how do we measure this happiness, and how does it translate to what's going on in the world? Well, there's a very interesting study that's gone on out there called the Happy Planet Index. And what the Happy Planet Index tries to do is to measure three things: our individual sense of well-being, which is based on our own opinion of how happy we are in our life, how well that we are doing. It's also based on our longevity, what is our life expectancy in each of the various countries around the world. And then this study also looks at ecological footprint. For each of these countries, how much resource do they use of the planet? Now, when you look at experienced well-being, you'll notice that with a few exceptions, the happiest places on the planet are North America, South America, Europe, and Australia. But when you compare that to the ecological footprint, what stands out is the fact that the United States, Canada, Europe, and Australia are the four different regions where there's a high correlation between that level of happiness and ecological footprint. Now, some of that makes perfect sense. This is the more developed part of the world. We have higher incomes. We have a better standard of living. And that standard of living typically relates to consumption. But I wondered, what does this mean for the rest of the world? And how did we get on this path of consumption? Now, after World War II, there was kind of a perfect storm, if you will, here in the United States. We had idle factories. We had a lot of pent-up demand. We had a baby boom on the way. And in 1955, Victor Lebeau, he tried to summarize his vision of what the world was going to look like. And in his mind, this rampant level of consumption was something, equivalent to our spiritual happiness. And so I thought about that, and I said, but at the time, most Americans were not that materialistic. We had just come out of a war. We had just come out of a depression before that. In fact, if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, to the beginning, before that time, it was impossible for somebody to really have a big ecological footprint. There were no washers and dryers and TVs and cars. And it's only recently that we've become a society that's really based a lot on possessions. So I wondered, what was that change that occurred? Well, as we all know now, Madison Avenue stepped in, and they created this mental stimulation to create what I think of as citizen as consumer. So for this past 50 years, we have really been on this kind of consumption rampage, if you will. But there's a problem with that. And the problem is that you can't have unlimited growth on a finite planet. That's simply unsustainable. It defies the laws of physics. It actually defies the fundamental properties of this planet that we live on. So when I look at fundamentals of planet Earth, I kind of break it into three categories. So you have what is fixed. And if you look at the planet, we're not getting any bigger. Millions of years ago, the Earth was kind of set. And we don't have any more air, we don't have any more water, we don't have any more soil other than what's available to us right now. But what has occurred over time is that the population has been increasing, and at the same time, the affluence of that population has been increasing. And that level of consumption from more people and more affluence has caused, obviously, more pollution, and our good friend here, CO2. Now, if you think about what's decreasing at the same time, that would be all of our non-renewable resources. Something like a tree grows, can be harvested, you can grow more trees. But when you think about things like fossil fuels, precious metals, minerals, what was in the earth is what's there, and all of those things are decreasing. So how does this play out on a global perspective? Well, what's happening is that the earth is feeling the effects of that. We're seeing the effects of CO2 right now, many places on the planet, especially in the Arctic regions. And this is something that is only going to become greater as time goes on. So let's think about China and India for a second. Each of these countries has 4 times the population of the United States. So that's 8 times the population in total. While they do not have our level of affluence, their growth rates are considerably higher. So they're trying to play catch up right now. And when you look at their per capita CO2 emissions, they're still much lower than the United States. But that's just on a per capita basis. China has already exceeded the CO2 emissions of the United States and Canada combined. And India recently pushed Russia out of 3rd place for emissions. So we have this dynamic here of 8 times the population, 4 times the growth rate, only 1/4 the CO2 emissions, but that's going to change here rapidly. And the key is that the growth that's occurring in other parts of the world is going to be massive. In fact, they're predicting that 3.2 billion people will be entering the middle class by 2030. Now imagine if those 3.2 billion people try to emulate our level of consumption, our level of affluence. And that got me thinking about the Curiosity rover that landed on Mars and how it's up there trying to look for signs of life. And maybe someday we'll actually send people to Mars to see if we can find some sign of life up there. But what's got me worried is that maybe this is what they're going to find. And that this is the fate of the world that we live in today, that our level of consumption is going to deplete resources to a point where we can't even sustain our own society. But there's a way that we can change all of that. And that's on 2 levels. One is to change our method of manufacturing, and the other is to change our patterns of consumption. Now, on the manufacturing side, one of the things that you'll notice about how we build things here in the world is that we've developed this linear process, which many people call take, make, and waste. We take the resources out of the ground, we make finished goods out of them, and when we're done, we just drop them off at the landfill. And that's an unsustainable type of practice. What we need to be doing is emulate what's already in place in nature. Now, when you go back to this example of how trees grow, they absorb water, nutrients, sunlight. This tree will grow, and when it dies, it remains in the ecosystem. It becomes a home to plants and animals and insects. And as it decomposes, it becomes food for the next tree that's going to grow. So this whole process of what we think of as waste becoming food for the next process is going to be critical as we develop business practices. And this cradle-to-cradle approach is being adopted by more companies in order to emulate exactly how nature operates. So in this kind of a model, everything becomes a nutrient for some new part of the process. You're either a biological nutrient or you're a technologist or a technical nutrient. And so if you ever maintain a compost, you see that in action every day, where you take scraps of food and you let that decompose and it becomes fertilizer for the next chain. So how do we do that within a business process? Well, one of the ways, and some companies are doing this already, Subaru has a plant where they make cars. And their commitment was that this was going to be a no landfill plant. They spent years working on all their processes to eliminate waste. And now they've been able to achieve this to a level where each of us in here on a daily basis will probably produce more waste than this entire auto plant does in a single year. They've figured that out. Nike is now starting to make shoes that come apart and go back into the ecosystem. It's either biodegradable or the components such as the plastics are recyclable. On the consumption side, we're seeing a lot of new innovation occur, a lot of that based around the internet, and about the fact that the internet now makes us so much more connected to each other. So these peer-to-peer networks are showing up. So take the automobile, for example. Your automobile probably sits in your garage or a parking lot 90% of its life. And you only use it for a very short amount. So why do we need to own so many cars? So there are now companies that allow you to rent cars by the hour so that you can pick it up on a corner, use it for half a day, and bring it back. There's ride-sharing networks out there. So if you need a ride from Boston to New York, you can look online, you can find other people who are making that same trip, and these programs will actually look at your social profile on sites such as Facebook and try to match you up with people who are compatible. Because probably the worst thing you'd want to do is drive from Boston to New York with some people you don't like in the car. And this is becoming a very common opportunity for people, not just to, to solve their transportation problem, but to meet other people in this peer-to-peer environment. Share some sugar. This is a very interesting idea in which it looks at the items that you have available to you, things that are probably sitting in your garage and that are just collecting dust. So imagine you need to chop some firewood. You need to go out and buy an axe. But you probably got an axe at your neighbor's house right down the street. So by people listing what kind of items they have, whether they be drills or any kind of appliance in their home, I mean, I think there was a study done on the electric cord drills, and they're used on average for like 10 minutes in their entire life. And the rest of the time they sit in the garage. So here's a way that people can actually share things that they own. Now, in some cases, there's a small fee, a rental fee for this. But in many cases, all you have to do is leave a deposit so that you bring it back. And the sharing is actually free. There's no charge for it. Again, this is not just a way to find something that you need for a short period of time, but this is also a way for you to connect with other people. And this model is being used in many different industries. Kids' toys. I mean, most children will use a toy for what, 6, 9 months, maybe a year, and they're on to a new toy. So there are now sites out there where you can rent kids' toys and be able to use them for as long as you want and send them back. So it's kind of a pay-as-you-go type of scheme. Airbnb is very interesting because this is a way for you to find either a room or an apartment, even an entire house for a trip, a business trip, or a vacation. So people can also put those items online and now start earning income. Now, we've had B&Bs around for a long time. And if you go to Europe, there are all kinds of signs everywhere where you can go rent somebody's room. But this kind of puts that whole model on steroids. And now they're booking millions of nights of stay, and people are now starting to connect in other countries. Now, the hotel industry may not be too happy with this, because that's taken away their business. But the benefit to the local community is that more of that money stays in the local economy. So there are many ways that people can make a change in the world. And one of those is by reconnecting with each other. And I think that by buying less stuff and starting to connect with people, we can change things. Now, some people will say, well, what's going to happen to the economy? If we buy less stuff, it's going to put people out of work. But I think the exact same amount of money is going to be spent, but it's going to be spent in other ways. We're going to find people spending more money on things like theater and art and music. We're going to see people spend money on things that are going to connect us. So I think in the end, we may be able to trade a bit of our stuff for richer relationships. And if it turns out that we can't figure this out in the next couple of decades, maybe Mother Nature will come and save us anyway. Thank you.